This week we're going to be covering the European expansion and voyages of exploration that led them to dominate trade in the Indian Ocean and then also to explore and develop new colonies in the New World, a territory that previously had been unknown to the European continent and countries on the continent. Now, there were a variety of reasons for these voyages of exploration. One of the biggest reasons was simply technological advances. Because of the intellectual revolution known as the Renaissance that we've already covered, there were many navigational improvements and inventions that came about that simply made oceanic voyages possible. There were a variety of things, techniques, new ships were developed, the astrolabe, things of that nature were developed that made the Europeans simply able to sail in the ocean away from the coastline. Because for many years when the Europeans sailed in the ocean, they could not leave the coastline. They became disoriented. They dominated in the Mediterranean Sea, but oceanic voyages were a little bit different. So the technological advances that came out of the Renaissance were one reason for these voyages of exploration. Another reason was the rise of centralized states. As we move through the 15th and into the 16th centuries, we see the rise of more centralized governments, a shift away from the feudal system that had dominated the political structure of the Middle Ages. These centralized governments saw kings and queens with considerable power that had money in their treasury, and they wanted to, so to speak, flex their muscles. And a great way for them to do that was to expand their influence by building an empire. And so the rise of centralized states was another reason for these voyages of exploration. A third reason was an economic factor. The Europeans had developed a taste for the luxury goods that came out of the East. The spices from India, the silks from China, and all of the various luxury items that the Europeans had simply become accustomed to. The problem that they were facing was that the only way to get these luxury goods was to travel through other countries, which was fine, except that you had to make sure that you stayed friends with those other countries, and you also had to pay them a premium to pass through their country to get to the luxury goods and get them back to the European countries. The European people decided that there must be a quicker way to get to these goods, and with the new technological advancements, they found another way to get there, so to speak, bypassing the middlemen of the empires of, say, the Ottoman, the Safavid empires, the Muslim empires of the Middle East. And so there was an economic motivation to get those luxury goods at a cheaper cost. The final big reason for these voyages of exploration on the big picture from the state's perspective was a religious motivation. There was definitely a lot of religious zeal in the European countries at this time. We've already talked about the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. This allowed people to be very excited about whatever religion they had chosen. In the Iberian Peninsula, which is where Portugal and Spain are located, they had recently kicked the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula. The Muslims were known as the Moors, and they had dominated in the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish and Portuguese countries had recently kicked the Moors, or the Muslims, out of the Iberian Peninsula, and were very excited to spread their Catholicism to the rest of the world and continue to fight the infidel wherever they may find them. So there was also a religious factor here as well. Now, for the individual explorers, there was certainly a desire for fame. Coming again out of the Renaissance, there was a desire for personal glory and personal fame, and the voyages of exploration really gave them an opportunity to gain that personal fame. And then there was also a desire for fortune. Many of the European explorers were not the eldest child in their family, and so therefore had very little job prospects and hope for personal wealth, and so they had to go outside of the box, so to speak, to find new avenues for jobs and for wealth. And the voyages of exploration gave them that option to gain personal fame as well as personal wealth. So those are the reasons that the explorations took place. The leader in the explorations out of Europe was Portugal. Portugal has a very large coastline. The only way for Portugal to get to the rest of Europe, in fact, is to go across the Atlantic Ocean. They are a little bit locked in on the coastline, but they're very familiar with the currents of the Atlantic Ocean, and so they really led the way. When they began exploring, they focused initially on the Indian Ocean and dominated trade in the Indian Ocean, tackling piracy wherever they found it. Piracy at this time was a big problem, and so they tackled piracy wherever they found it, and they really dominated trade in the Indian Ocean for a little while. When Portugal saw great success in this avenue, then the Spanish and the Dutch followed suit, and then ultimately, as we know, the English come to dominate trade across and much of the world by the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries. So we see Spain and Portugal really taking the lead. Now, at some point, the Spanish in particular realized that trade in the Indian Ocean was not enough, and so they turned their attention to the Americas because explorers like Christopher Columbus and Vespucci Amerigo discovered a new world known as the Americas. And so conquistadors such as Hernando Cortez, who conquered the Aztec or Mexica Empire, and Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Inca Empire, began to turn their attention to the West and to building colonies in this new world. Now, one of the things that I would like you to focus on as you look at the exploration and the setup of colonies by Spain and Portugal in the New World, in the Americas, is how did they structure these colonies? For what purpose did they use these colonies? And why is it that the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, when they fought for their independence in the 19th century, had so many issues establishing independence and establishing viable countries once they gained their independence? Whereas colonies, for example, the North American colonies settled by the British, once we fought for our independence, were able to form a functional government and succeed, albeit with some errors, but we have succeeded overall. So I want you to look at that. What does this contact mean for times in the future as we go through this chapter? Another thing that I would like you to focus on is why the Europeans were able to conquer so easily in the Mexica or Aztec Empire as well as in the Inca Empire. And those reasons have to do with disease. They have to do with ideas about warfare that differed between each culture, as well as religious beliefs of both territories, both cultures. And then the final thing that I would like you to look at, and this is covered very well in your book, is the impact of this contact between the Europeans and the new peoples of the Americas. It's called the Columbian Exchange in your textbook, and it is one of your ID terms. And I'd like for you to really focus on what did the Columbian Exchange, this exchange of goods and ideas between the Americas and the European countries, what did that mean for the American people, for the European people, as well as for the world at large? There are a number of things that develop out of this Columbian Exchange that have a long-term impact on world history. As usual, I will be posting a forum question Monday morning by 9 a.m. I will also be posting a quiz Friday by 9 a.m. Both of these assignments will be due Sunday by 11:55 p.m. If you have any questions about this material, don't hesitate to contact me via email, or of course my phone number will work as well. Have a great week.